All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Mike Talbot, and I am Notre Dame International's Director for Initiatives in Mexico. Today is the 7th in the Mexico Virtual Lecture Series, presented by Notre Dame's Mexico Global Center. These lectures are intended to highlight the work of Notre Dame researchers in Mexico and to deepen the community of partners we have here. This semester, we're highlighting the research of Notre Dame graduate students. We're very glad that you could all be with us today. Before we begin, just a few requests. You've heard these 1,000 times by this point, but please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation. This will just help us avoid some unwanted background noise that might disturb the presentation. Second, feel free to submit questions at any point during the presentation. The easiest way to do that is via the chat feature at the end. At the end of the presentation, Kayla will address as many questions as time permits. So today we are very pleased to have Kayla Hurd with us. Kayla is a doctoral candidate in Notre Dame's Department of Anthropology. She is a Notre Dame Dean's Fellow as well as a Graduate Research Fellow at the Eck Institute for Global Health. She is a biocultural anthropologist, with interests in food and nutrition, diet-related disease, health, political economy, and multi-species anthropology. Her research examines how social, cultural, political, and economic factors often construct what is considered edible in areas around the world. We're very excited to have Kayla with us today. She obviously has a deep knowledge and expertise in this area. And just candidly, I find it super interesting. So I'm really excited about it. Thank you, Kayla, very much for joining us today. With no further ado, please join me in welcoming her.
All right, thanks so much for that great introduction, Mike. Like you said, I'm an anthropology student at Notre Dame, and I'm very pleased to share some of my preliminary data with you guys, as well as kind of my future directions for my dissertation research. Unfortunately, I should have been in Mexico right now doing this dissertation research, but because of COVID, my plans have been delayed. I'm hoping to go in the spring semester, but right now I'm doing some virtual ethnography that I'm really excited to share with you guys today as well. So we did have a little bit of a technical glitch, so Mike's gonna help me out, and if you could do next slide for me, please. So I'm just going to do a broad overview about what anthropology is in case there's members in the audience that are unfamiliar with what the field is. So specifically, it's the holistic study of humankind in all its forms. So you can kind of think about anthropology as studying people, and the different subfields within anthropology are vast and broad as well. We have cultural, linguistic, archaeology, and biological. If you could go next slide, please. So I'm kind of a medical anthropologist, and I'll break that down for you a little bit as well. So it can be both an applied and an academic discipline. So an applied anthropological perspective kind of looks at contemporary social issues and tries to help with solving social problems and informing policy with the general public. And in an academic sense, we look at more of a medical anthropology, makes the distinction between disease and illnesses, as well as health threats, and looking at the condition of the health perceived or felt by the individual, or the lived experience in theoretical or more of an academic setting. Next slide. And I kind of bridge the gaps between biocultural research and medical anthropology. So if you consider biological anthropology as looking at the human body in all its forms, and cultural anthropology as looking at the cultural uniqueness or distinctiveness between groups of people and comparing those perspectives, I blend these two fields and focusing on the understandings of health, illness, and healing in all its forms. So you can seek to understand how and show how health is rooted in cultural conceptions, social connections, and human biology. So my research kind of mixes all of these different things to understand basic human uniqueness and through food and nutrition. Next slide. So I also use a critical approach to biocultural and medical anthropology. Critical biocultural perspective recognizes that human behavior is shaped by both evolutionary and cultural histories. And so as you think of humans and the different life history stages from adolescence all the way through adulthood, you can see that in an evolutionary sense, people's bodies have been shaped by natural selection and the different environmental challenges, as well as the social and cultural challenges, whether that be structural and social, the social, political, and economic factors that have implications on their body. Next slide. So specifically, I look at the health and nutrition. While other biocultural anthropologists have studied the biological effects of racism or the evolutionary causes of different structural factors that have affected the body, I look specifically at how nutritional deficiencies can cause disease and illness, and not necessarily in this evolutionary framework, but in the past, we've had to meet different nutritional needs that had implications for survival and fitness for the human race. Next slide. And if we think about agriculture and the domestication of food groups, we can show that the agriculture actually allowed the establishment of the large population centers that we do see today. And from a nutritional standpoint, most of these people that used agriculture led lives that were inferior to different foraging groups because of the reliance and the dependence on one stable food crop, which made these large populations vulnerable to both chronic shortages, occasional famines, and missing essential nutrients. So you can kind of see that on the development of agriculture, which was a great development in our industrial history, it had some shortfalls and miscomings along our nutritional needs and evolutionary past. Next slide. And if we fast forward to today, we can see that these processed foods pose a global health problem because of the excess amount of calories that are in easily purchasable cheap foods that that most people rely on in these large population centers today. So there's a concept called the dual burden of malnutrition that I'd like to briefly go into, that poses that there's a lot of micronutrient deficiencies like iron deficiency with the establishment of chronic diseases such as type 2 diabetes and obesity as well, because of some of these foods that have been incorporated into our diets today. Next slide. And so with this abundance of these processed low calorie or high calorie, low nutritive value foods, we can see that the food and industrialized subsistence systems, there is a prevalence of metabolic syndromes among the population. So they have a lot of different risk factors, such as obesity and blood fat disorders, as well as elevated blood pressure and insulin resistance. So you can kind of see that the basic food necessities that everybody needs kind of has an intermingling and a commingling effect of these diseases if you don't have the right proportions or the right foods that you rely upon every day. Next slide. So while we're thinking globally, I want to focus in on Mexico specifically. Next slide. So in Mexico, as many people are aware, especially in this this lecture today, that there is a reliance upon high calorie, low nutrient value foods as a process of NAFTA because of the global exportation of some of these food products into Mexico City centers. And they also have a very high level of non-communicable chronic diseases, as well as communicable diseases and infection rates, such as iron deficiency anemia, type 2 diabetes, and high levels of obese populations. Next slide. And this is because of the global and local structural, social, cultural forces that are having direct implications on people's food choice and then downstream biological effects on people's bodies. And this is what I aim to study in my future dissertation research. Next slide. So I want to shift gears just a little bit with keeping all of these theoretical concepts in mind, because while we have the establishment of agriculture and some of these processed food products, I want to think about what this has on future implications for the global population, because by 2050, it's expected that the population will increase to about 9 billion people worldwide. The current agriculture and livestock production model is currently unsustainable if this prediction were to come true, because of the effects of greenhouse gas, the use of water, as well as the land usage that goes towards meat production and current livestock use. Next slide. So if we think about a possible alternative that may have already been put into people's diets all around the globe, the Food and Agriculture Organization proposed that insects could be this possible alternative to the current livestock model because of their, next slide, please, environmental benefits, next slide, economic benefits, and nutritional benefits. Next slide, please. So entomophagy is the technical term for the practice of eating insects. And globally, 2 billion people already consume insects worldwide. And this ranges from 1,900 different species of insects that are variable in the micronutrients that they provide, but they mostly are high in fat, protein, vitamins, fiber, and other mineral content as well. And in some cases, nearly 100 grams, so about a serving sample of, if you think of a playing deck size of cards, that's about 100 grams. So you can think about that will cover about 100% of different micronutrient needs. So one simple serving can kind of cover your whole daily consumption. So if you see on this picture right here, these are the chapulines that are prevalent in Oaxaca, Mexico. I actually took this picture, and we'll talk more about those in just a few minutes. Go ahead. So this is a kind of a breakdown of what edible insect species are kind of out there. So they're the popularity in percentage by different orders of insects. So kind of right in the middle at about 10%, we can see that there's cicadas, plant hoppers, different scale insects. And above that at 13% is where those grasshoppers, locusts, and crickets fall into, and that's where those chapulines would fit in. They are really prevalent in Mexico and Oaxaca specifically, and those are the ones that I like to talk about the most. But there, as you can see, there's a variable amount of different kinds, and they all have different nutritional content as well. Next slide, please. So environmentally, insects are more efficient than the current livestock production model. So they use 38 times less land than beef or cattle, for example, and 23 times less water, 12 times less feed than current cattle usage. And while the cattle also produce about 2,000 times more greenhouse gases. So they have a really detrimental effect on the environment. Next slide. And so insects then are way more nutritionally rich, as other food organizations have studied, and as well as some of the chemical analyses that I've done in the past as well. So dependent on species, they can be at least 2 times more rich in their protein content, with 12 times more calcium and 2 times more iron content than other forms of meat, such as beef, chicken, or pork. Next slide. So this is from an analysis that I've done in the past with some colleagues at San Diego State University. And these were specifically from 3 different species of insects found in Oaxaca, Mexico. And you can see that chiquitanas on the left-hand side had about upwards of 28% protein for their dry weight content. And chapulines fell directly under that at from 22.5% to about 25%. And you can see this comparison between other forms of protein, such as egg, chicken, pork, and beef, that they all fall short in the same serving size comparison. Next slide. So you might think, if you've tried insects already, and if you haven't, I apologize. When I do talks like this in person, I usually do bring a sample for those willing to try. But like places in the United States, people don't usually talk about eating insects as a common form of protein. So this kind of brings about an ick factor, or don't yuck my yum, because food attitudes do change. So you can think about a common comparison about seafood. So lobster or crustaceous foods or animals, they have been considered disgusting in the past, but now they're a delicacy. So it's kind of about changing the cultural side of and discussion of what insects can do to your food and nutrition and environment, that we have to kind of turn the page and write the next chapter for the promotion of edible insects in places like the United States. Next slide, please. So to kind of wrap the things all together that I've already discussed, I designed a pilot study in which I went to Oaxaca, Mexico 4 times throughout 2019 in January, May, August, and December, because I wanted to explore if there was a correlation between seasonality and of edible insects and the diet changes that go along with changing of seasons, and how this affected iron levels for an adult population in Oaxaca, Mexico. And as I've alluded to before, Oaxaca is a dynamic center for their food as well as for edible insects. So I thought this was an ideal location to study kind of this intermingling effect of food, insect, and bodily changes. So I had 3 aims in this study, in which I wanted to identify how seasonality affects diet for people living in Oaxaca. And I wanted to see additionally how this diet affects overall health status through the examination of iron levels, and identify how the consumption of grasshoppers affects rates of iron deficiency anemia as a tertiary aim of the study. Next slide, please. So how I designed this study was I went to a local preschool where I talked to several of the mothers and fathers and asked them to record their diets for the day of the interview, the day before the interview, and a typical diet or what their meals would look like during that week in each season. So these are called food frequency questionnaires. And I asked them to, one, denote what they had, and that if they had a sandwich, I asked them what was on their sandwiches and approximate portion size. So we used, as you can see in the right-hand top picture, little portion cups to approximate cup size. And as well, during these interviews, I asked several questions regarding diet and the seasonality of foodstuffs. So I asked who prepared the food that day, who would typically go for groceries, what the atmosphere was like, where they bought their groceries, all different questions about the procurement of this food, as well as we also did a health assessment. So I would use a HemaQ, and it's an instant read measurement to instantaneously read the hemoglobin levels via a blood or finger prick. And so I would get a drop of blood and be able to give back the results immediately to my participants, as well as we would take skin folds and height weights of the participants as well. And I did this 4 times. So next slide, please. This is kind of a zoom in look at some of my equipment. So you have a voice recorder because I recorded my interviews, the different measuring cups to record the portion sizes, as well as the HemaQ to collect those blood spots. And I collected over the course of the 4 seasons, 111 data points, which included those food frequency questionnaires, the blood spots, and the bodily measurements, as well as interview data. Next slide. So a preliminary analysis, I asked questions a lot about what people consider chapulines, and I got a lot of different responses. So a lot of my participants, I asked them, are chapulines food? Do you consider them insects, or do you consider them animals or a food product? So I got a lot of different stories about seasonality, the culture in Oaxaca, and the cost of these in comparison to other foodstuffs. So one participant said that they believe that these chapulines are food because they supposedly live in the milpa, and that they eat the herbs. So they're because they eat these herbs, they have a lot of protein and a lot of micronutrients, and so they were aware of what these insects ate, transformed, and were able to be good nutrients for themselves if you consume them as well. So then in this, talking about seasonality, another participant said that this interview, I believe, was in May. This one was in August. So they're talking about the seasonality in about May and June was when the chapulines were kind of thriving. And so when I talked to them about the markets in where people would purchase chapulines, so they believed that the chapulines that they're currently selling were from Puebla. So the ones in Puebla were considered not as good as the chapulines that were from Oaxaca. Next slide, please. So then in another question, a lot of my participants, I had this idea of, well, if I'm doing a comparison between chapulines and meat sources of protein, such as beef, chicken, or pork, well, do people consider chapulines or other insects a type of meat? So I had a lot of variants as well, but people decided that because chapulines don't necessarily have a flesh, but they have more of like a little shell or chitin outside. They're not necessarily meat, but they are a form of protein. So it was interesting to see that distinction. And a lot of people picked up on the chitin and the exoskeleton of insects and being allergic to that, as like they are allergic to other forms of shellfish. So there's that similarity again between shellfish and insects and that consumption of them. Next slide, please. So considering these interview questionnaires and the preliminary results of my biological data, I looked at the women's consumption of these chapulines and tried to link and correlate those to their BMI levels, their hemoglobin levels, and the percentage of calories that they consumed from what I would call traditional or local Oaxacan foods or more processed diets. So those correlations didn't necessarily work out, but For the women that consumed more processed foods, they did indeed have higher hemoglobin levels than other people that consumed a greater percentage of raw food calories or local Oaxacan flavors as well. And that women that had higher BMIs also had higher hemoglobin levels. So while I didn't necessarily see a correlation between the consumption of chapulines with the iron levels that I was hoping for, I'm still working through this analysis because I have a lot of data to go through, but my preliminary results saying that there's not necessarily a strict correlation. Next slide, please. So with this picture, I'm trying, and with the thoughts of COVID and all these things around the limitations of the research that have already been, that COVID has brought on, I've been thinking a lot about what comfort food is and what food does to the soul and to the body. So I've been trying to look through all of my data and think of new ideas of what does food mean to a person individually. Next slide, please. So if we look at foods like mole, next slide, tlayudas, next slide, these chapulines, and finally the last slide, and other traditional foods like quesadillas and sopes, we can think about what these traditional foods resonate in the mind, the spirit, and how people use food to really cope with such structural and societal change like a pandemic might bring about. So what types of foods do people turn to in high stress times, and what foods do people crave in these instances? Next slide, please. So my research questions that have sprung from my preliminary research till now are looking more at how are people's food choices impacted by structural and political economic factors such as a pandemic or other times of high stress. Next slide. So which foods do people turn to for comfort during these stressful times? So kind of doing the same food frequency analysis as before, but really kind of diving into the categorization of foodstuffs and how people perceive them as being comforting or not. And 3. And so then I want to explore what effects, if any, does the pandemic have on diet, nutrition, and the body by seeing the different correlations between and categorizations of foodstuffs and the downstream biological effects on these choices. So then my central hypothesis is that these structural and societal factors will shape how different communities view and impact their access to comfort food and what people perceive as comfort food, the definition. And while these two categories of processed foods or local Oaxacan dishes are just two of the different categories that I might explore, we can see that they're already going to have different downstream biological effects that have different diet-related health outcomes, such as higher levels of blood glucose, CRP, which is, and BMI, body fat as well. Next slide, please. So I've begun to explore some of these questions already by doing virtual ethnography with about 6 participants that are currently living in Oaxaca in the pandemic. And I've asked questions about what it means, or how your diet has changed since the onset of the pandemic, how difficult it is to get food, whether or not the comfort foods that you once thought were comforting prior to the pandemic are still comforting. And I've had quite a bit of quite a bit of interest in the topic, as well as you can see I've had the food frequency questionnaires on the left-hand side where people are listing out all their foods, and on the right-hand side there's different pictures of their lunches. And people are definitely feeling some of the stress that the pandemic has brought about, and that their diet has definitely changed, and it's actually becoming healthier. So it'll be interesting to see once I am able to travel to Oaxaca if there is biological effects because of the healthier at-home local food diets that people are turning to during this stressful time. Next slide, please. So kind of just a picture of me wishing I was back in Oaxaca and doing this research so I can share more results with you guys in the times to come. Next slide. So I want to thank you all for attending my lecture today, and the participants and collaborators that I do have in Oaxaca, Mexico, because without them, this research wouldn't be possible, as well as my funding agencies and my committee, Vanya Smithoka, Lee Getler, and Julie Lesnick, as well as my research assistant, Mags, who has helped me crunch a lot of the numbers in the nutritional analysis as well. So one more slide, and I'll be happy to answer any questions people have today.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Kayla. This was so interesting. A reminder to everyone, please feel free to submit questions via the chat feature. Or if you'd like to unmute your microphone and ask directly, feel free to do so. Sometimes it is a little difficult to see if you use the raise hand feature. So just make sure that you speak up if you do want to ask a question. I'll get us started. The idea of comfort food is very interesting, and certainly we're probably all craving some comfort food over these past 6 months. You mentioned that people have turned more to a healthier, presumably more traditional diet. It's my recollection that in this past August, Oaxaca also implemented some bans on sugary drinks, which may be replicated elsewhere in other states as well. I'm not sure. And of course, we've recently seen the addition of warning labels about food being high in fat and sugar, etc. At least here in Mexico City. I think that might be the case in Oaxaca as well. Does that have an impact as well, or do you think it's more about people returning to, like you said, desire for comfort and traditional food?
Yeah, I mean, so I did see that mandate in Oaxaca and that press release about banning the sugary soft drinks like Coca-Cola. So it's a hypothesis right now that they could turn to some of these local flavors for comfort, but I've definitely seen some of these. I'm interested to see what other people will turn to. I'm working with a small sample right now of people in Oaxaca, and they've turned to some of these healthier diets just because they're cooking at home. They're not going to restaurants anymore or anything like that. But when I am allowed to travel, I want to ask people to reflect upon their diets prior to the pandemic, to the pandemic, and then when I'm able to return and see if there's anything of people's perceptions of what comfort is, or if it's just food and they're just wanting to eat what's ever available. Does that kind of answer what you're looking for?
That does, thank you. And there's a similar question here from Catherine. She says, of course, your research focuses on Mexico, but she's wondering if you have any initial indications of similar turns towards healthier eating habits in the last 6 months in other countries as well, presumably due to the pandemic. You know, you mentioned people not going to restaurants. Obviously, that's been a case in a lot of places, but have you heard about that elsewhere?
I haven't. So I know I was trying to kind of mentally track and just on Facebook or see other people's posts, at least in the United States, like all of the foods that people were trying to purchase and the shortages in grocery stores, like meat was really hard and not available, like kind of how toilet paper for some reason in the United States was running off the shelves. But I know that people are eating at home more, they're not going out as much. So that's something I haven't heard much of from other countries, but because most of my attention's been on Mexico and the United States.
That makes sense. I should note, so Vanya seeded a question in the chat about how best to translate comfort food. There's a discussion going on here that I'll be sure to save it for you.
I have a question too, Mike.
Please, go ahead.
Well, Carla, I just want to know if you have studied the satisfaction. I mean, if you were talking about replacing or suggesting to replace meat, I love chapulines, but I just don't feel that are satisfying, my hunger.
Right.
Have you studied that, the sensation, the satisfaction?
So I haven't, the sensation and satisfaction are great words that I can definitely explore more, but it has come up that the chapulines are more of a snack. So they're something people munch on, and they're not necessarily filling, but they're, and that's part of it too, is that in different locations, even within Oaxaca, in urbanized settings, people say that the chapulines are like culturally satisfying, and they're culturally part of what it means to be Oaxacan. But in rural centers, they're kind of a form of nostalgia as well as a food of desperation. So they're not necessarily satisfying in that regard, but that's something I can explore more too, about like the sensation of the fulfillment as in comparison to meat. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Kayla.
Yeah.
Ignacio asks, you mentioned 2 billion people eat insects. Is Mexico high on that list? I mean, it's very common here. You walk, even in Mexico City, you walk in a market and you can see baskets of chapulines. What are some of the other places where people like to eat insects as well? And how does Mexico rank in terms of prevalence?
Yeah, so Mexico is pretty high on the list. They actually have some of the most diverse species. So there's reports saying that there's 300 different edible insect species in Mexico, all the way up to 550 different edible insect species just residing in Mexico. So there's a lot of variance about these different reports. And I don't know necessarily about ranking, but Mexico's definitely high up on the list. That's why it was one of the reasons why I chose to study the biological effects of consuming insects, was a place in Mexico. Other places are India, Southwest Asia, Africa is really high on the list as well. So it's pretty much prevalent everywhere except for the United States and some places in Europe. And you can think about that too. One of my advisors, Julie Lesnick, she also studies edible insects. You can think about the line of the equator and the tropical region. You're going to get the most consumption of insects along that tropical region in the equator because that's where the most diverse insect species live. And so that's, as you get closer and closer to the poles, there's less insects and less people consuming them.
Thank you. So Jay, thanks you for a great talk. He's asking, did you or will you ask your informants about their thoughts on the environmental benefits of insects in the diet? Or are food choices made for entirely or predominantly traditional and or economic reasons?
So I haven't dived into the environmental benefits necessarily yet with some of the people in Oaxaca, but we talked a lot about the medical benefits of eating chapulines too. Some people commented about how you can consume them to cure a cough or consume them for different, my first initial reaction was, what about iron deficiency anemia? Can people cure that by consuming insects, or at least treat it as an ailment because of the high levels of iron and protein in these insects? And so some people were aware of it, but some people definitely we're less aware of these benefits of consuming insects. Pretty much every time I give this a talk or a variance of this talk, the environmental benefits are what people are drawn to. So it would be interesting to see the other side of that, where I ask other people what these benefits could be. So thank you.
Ignacio is also wondering, have you found amongst your informants a new appreciation for eating crickets? That is to say, people who did not eat it traditionally, are they, given the pandemic or other circumstances, finding themselves more open to eating it now?
So when I give this talk in person too, I usually do bring crickets or a cricket protein powder that I could turn into cupcakes. So they're like really good. They're almost taste like multi-grain cupcakes. And so they're really good for you, and they're really nice to eat too. But a lot of people turn away from talks like this, or talks that Dr. Lesnick gives with this new appreciation for eating crickets or other forms of insects. They are getting a lot of attention right now, or they're going to be in the next few years, especially with other alternative protein products, kind of like Beyond Meat or Impossible Food too. So it's just other alternative options that have better environmental benefits and are more eco-friendly. I hope that answers your question, Ignacio.
Great. So Angie Esteve asked a question that actually I've always kind of been curious about as well. You see these huge piles of insects, chapulines. How are they gathered and sent to market? Are they farmed? I mean, I imagine gathering them by hand must take a lot of time. Yeah,
so this was actually one of my first questions that I asked people in the marketplace, is how are all these there? Because if you go down a slide or two, I have some pictures to show you guys, a couple more. So those are cochineal, and these are chiquitanas. So in Bonito, so this is perfect. You could go back to the one more slide, right there. So this is in Bonito Juarez, and so I asked this vendor how she gathered these insects, and actually she paid people that gathers these insects, and they are somewhat farmed. So if you think about, they do take a long time to process too, but they can take upwards of a week to process, so that they are gathered and their excrements are excreted. And so let me take you through the process a little bit. So they're kind of born and not necessarily raised, but they can be farmed in the milpa. So they're eating naturally in the milpa fields, and people do collect them with a copal. So it's a large net that people have to go early in the morning while they're still kind of not so active, and you can find them in the milpa and you collect them. So once you collect them, you put them in usually a box or a basket, and you seal off the air so that they die naturally. So this is the long process of how to do so. Some people boil them, and they're not as good that way, but if you really take the time to get the excrement out and kill them naturally, that's better for you nutritionally as well. So after a few days, after they've all humanely died, then you fry them and season them, and that's how they bring them to the market. So it's kind of a long, daunting process, but it's definitely worth it.
Fascinating. It looks like Patricia has a question as well.
Well, I don't know if it's a question or a comment. I was watching the TV program, the Shark Tank Mexico last Friday, mm-hmm. and one of the products that they were presenting were insects. They're called Sofo. I think is the name of the product. They're not chapulines. It's another insect. And there's other there's another snack made with chapulines that is also packaged, and it's called Winko. And I don't know if how well these products are selling, because some people reject the snacks just because of the aspect that they have. They are packaged. They could probably be sold in the supermarkets and things, but they're not. The people are buying potato chips instead of buying chips with insects. And I think a lot of this is cultural, because we have to learn to like these things. That's why people in Oaxaca eat the chapulines, because they're used to it. The other way, people have to learn to incorporate these things into their diets.
Yes, so you're exactly right.
and I think that if we had television programs with some of these telenovelas and things where they were eating some of these insects, people would start reacting differently. But if you can get this Shark Tank program that they had on Friday, where you see the reaction that some of the sharks had towards tasting the insects, it was very interesting, because some of them said, okay, they're very good, but I don't like the aspect. And two of them had decided not to try them. They just couldn't put them in their mouths. Right. So there's a lot of learning that will have to take place, because when you put the insects in the taco, or you have a salsa that includes the chapulines, people are probably not looking at the insect, and they're not conscious of what they're eating. Yep. But when you see the insect, many people will reject just because of the idea. So it's a learning process. How do you take this custom of eating chapulines in Oaxaca to other places in Mexico or to other countries? It's a cultural thing that we have to include so as to make it more environmentally friendly. But Definitely. It's an educational program that you have to probably include that in your dissertation, how some of the ideas of how to teach people or how to educate people to include insects into their diets. Because when you've tasted a taco with the gusanos de maguey, you'll go back to eating insects again. But they're not even easy to get.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comment. And you're exactly right. So like those are some of the challenges that are surrounding this research and surrounding just the promotion of edible insects in places like the United States. I've definitely seen a lot more information about them coming out, because actually in 2013 was the first time some people started promoting edible insects. And so since then, we've just seen more and more and more things come out. So some of the professional baseball fields have actually started selling chapulines as a comparison to popcorn, and people are consuming them, and they couldn't keep them, the vendor stands open in some of these things as well. Chirps chips, Jay, definitely. I have a picture of the Chirps chips. Those are delicious. And as Patricia said, yeah, many chefs are including them. So it's kind of just this niche construction of introducing people and educating them, as Patricia had said, that we just need to be aware of the benefits. And it's actually been easier to talk to children about consuming insects and kind of introducing them. I've given a lot of talks at local elementary schools, and while some kids are disgusted and won't try an insect, others think it's fantastic and it's great, and they want to take some home to show their parents. And it's definitely going to be a social and cultural movement to turn to these alternative forms of protein. That's going to take time.
Wonderful. I have an additional question. I'm just curious more about the health benefits. I mean, I know you looked at the micronutrient levels and the iron levels. what kind of lasting impact would that have? So like, for example, how long does that iron stay in your system? Is the seasonality mean that people are healthier during the Chapulines season, and outside of season they don't have access to it? Or is there like a delay benefit that you can see several months after regularly consuming chapulines and other insects?
Right, so that's a fantastic question, and actually we're still trying to do these studies. I'm actually one of the first people to study the biological and health benefits in real contemporary people today, because a lot of the health data that we have is kind of just the nutritive food calorie consumption data. So it's just, okay, put this food in an HPLC or different chemical analysis, this instrument, and it's going to spit out data. We don't really necessarily have a lot of data on, well, it's gone through a person's body. How long does iron stores happen after consuming insects? There's one other study by Marilyn Shockley. She studied the gut microbiome and the effects of consuming insects over a prolonged period, about a week or so. And that was the first study, and that was published in like 2018, to really see some of these biological effects on the body about consuming insects. So it's a very long and tedious process that we're starting to get into to really understand what some of these nutritional benefits could be and what this looks like for health status of people. And because there's so many different insects that have variable nutritional content, it's all ongoing and so variable, we don't know yet. So fantastic question, and I wish I had a better answer for you.
Well, this has been an absolutely fascinating hour. We're coming up on noon here in Mexico City. I know it's 1 o'clock for you. I just want to, on behalf of all of us, thank you for the presentation. Like I said, it was super interesting, and it made me incredibly hungry. So I'm probably going to have a very large lunch today.
Well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. And if anybody else has questions, I think my email was on the invite, and if not, you can find my link on the anthropology website, and I'd be happy to answer anybody else's questions later on.
Great, thank you. For everyone else, thanks for joining us. We really appreciated your being here. Look forward to the next lecture, which will be on October 15th. We're going to highlight Jorge Puma, who's a doctoral student in the history department, some of his research about international exchange students and their influence and impact on social movements during the long 60s here in Mexico. So look forward to that. Information and invitations will be going out hopefully in the next week or so. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have a great day.